Society. We've got a really important issue to talk with you about today and some great panelists. You've probably heard of this. It's called H.R. 1. The official title is the For the People Act of 2021. But our guests are going to explain it as anything but for the people. It was passed in the U.S. House of Representatives by a vote of 220 to 210 with 0 Republican support. You're going to learn why today. H.R. 1 is raising alarm bells on a variety of fronts that we're going to be talking about. So today, our experts are going to be talking about this bill's impact on the integrity of elections, the negative effect on public discourse and donor privacy, and also the potential for its provision to eventually lead to one-party rule. We'll also tell you about the specific potential impact here on North Carolina. Now, each of these things, of course, is alarming on its own, but when you take them together, this really is H.R. 1, a recipe for instability in a country where we're already suffering from a lot of discontent and turmoil. Joining us today for this conversation, North Carolina Congressman David Rouser. He represents the 7th District of our state. Also joining us, Bradley Smith. He is chairman of the Institute for Free Speech. He is the former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. He served on that board from 2000 to 2005. And my colleagues here at the John Locke Foundation, Dr. Andy Jackson is director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity. He is our elections expert. And John Guzet, he is senior fellow in legal studies. He is an attorney. Here also my colleague at the John Locke Foundation. Panelists, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. Congressman Rouser, let's start with you if we could. You voted no on H.R. 1. What are your concerns?
Multifaceted concerns. In fact, one of the biggest concerns that we have is that it basically would nationalize into federal law all those changes that were made in the variety of states, 6 states in particular, that were in question in the presidential election. So mass mail-in balloting would be the law of the land. If your state has voter ID, voter ID, you would not be permitted to continue with that. Basically, the integrity of the election across the board in every state in the country would be suspect, significantly so. A number of provisions in this bill cause great concern. One, it allows felons to vote. You have mandatory same-day voter registration. It requires a mandatory 2 weeks of early voting. It requires public funding of campaigns, a 6-to-1 taxpayer match for contributions up to $200. So if you're a liberal, for example, one individual that most liberals don't support is Donald Trump. He's one of the greatest small donor fundraisers out there. And of course, the reason why the Democrats put this in the package is they believe it would be great advantage to them in the Senate races and the House races out there. I don't think most people want their taxpayer dollars to go fund a candidate who is not of their choice. And this is a provision that really concerns me. It automatically registers individuals to vote from state databases, the DMV database, for example. The welfare database, for example, of all the welfare offices. So basically, it enables the Democrat Party to cast the net far and wide, send ballots to these addresses to multiple people, and then mandates ballot harvesting, where these ballots are basically filled out and sent in and dropped off at the county boards of election. And so it really are a significant number of provisions that are very concerning. Another provision that really struck me as pretty bad, it requires states to count ballots cast by voters outside of their precincts. So that's another fundamental change. And then it weaponizes the FEC. Right now you have a 6-member FEC commission. They would basically make that a 5-member commission, make it a partisan commission, which really, I think, is the telltale of all provisions in this bill of what they're really trying to do.
Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate you summarizing that. And again, Congressman Rouser voted no on H.R. 1. You mentioned the FEC. One of our guests today is the former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Bradley Smith now is the chairman of the Institute for Free Speech. Chairman Smith, give us a sense of why your organization, the Institute for Free Speech, is so concerned.
Okay, well, thank you, Donna. The voting rights provision of H.R. 1 are extremely important. I mean, they're vitally important for reasons the Congressman began to touch on. But unfortunately, getting ignored and all the attention on the federalization of elections and the bad practices that would be mandated are equally important First Amendment issues in what is, by the way, an 800-page bill. And these First Amendment issues, this bill can be said is nothing less than a blatant attempt to silence political dissent. Specifically, H.R. 1 would unconstitutionally regulate any speech that mentions a federal candidate or elected official at any time under the vague standard of whether the speech promotes, attacks, supports, or opposes the candidate or official. This standard has all been impossible to understand and would likely regulate any mention of an elected official who hasn't yet announced their retirement. And the effect of this, of course, would be to leave the media, which is exempt from all this, in even greater control of public discourse and messaging. And as we saw in the last several years, the media has pretty much abandoned all pretense of objectivity in reporting on public affairs. The bill would force groups to file burdensome and duplicative reports with the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, if they sponsor any ads that are deemed to promote, attack, support, or oppose the president or members of Congress in an attempt to persuade those officials to support or oppose policy issues, including legislation like H.R. 1, by the way. It would compel groups to declare on new publicly filed, quote, campaign-related disbursement reports, whether their ads are, quote, in support of or opposition to the elected official mentioned, even if the ads are neither. They just mention or urge people to contact that official. It would force groups that publicly identify their donors on reports for issue ads on the face of the ads themselves, leaving these donors subject to harassment campaigns and boycotts that are so popular in what some call our cancel culture. I prefer to call it what it is, just our boycott and blacklist culture that are so common these days. And in many instances, the donors being identified will have provided no funding for the ads in question. They funded the organization for other purposes. Faced with this prospect of being inaccurately associated with what by law would be considered, quote, campaign ads, even if they're not campaign ads, in FEC reports and disclaimers, many donors will simply stop giving to these nonprofits, or these groups will self-censor. Further, it would force organizations that make grants to other groups to publicly identify their donors if the organization is deemed to have any, quote, reason to know that a donee entity might make in the future campaign-related disbursements. This vague and new subjective standard will increase the legal issues and the cost of vetting grants, and many groups are simply going to stop making grants. All of this is bad for democracy, of course. It focuses attention on the individuals and the donors associated with the sponsoring organizations rather than on messages, on public affairs, pluses and minuses of legislation. It exacerbates the politics of personal destruction, and it further coarsens political discourse. And all of this is, as Congressman Rouser mentioned, to be enforced by a new partisan FEC, traditionally a bipartisan agency. This agency will be controlled by appointees of the Biden administration through at least the 2026 midterms, right? So we have, again, a sense of what some of the goal is here. It's not extreme in this scenario to say that this is the most far-reaching effort that we've ever seen to insulate a majority from political challenge, and it must be defeated. I've been battling on these election issues and free speech issues for a long time, these kind of process-related issues. I've been there for lots of state wars. I've been there through McCain-Feingold years ago and so on. And there's an expression I've never used before, but I would use in connection with this bill. H.R. 1 is a hill to die on. Thanks.
Boy, an awful lot included in that. We'll get back to some of these specific concerns a little bit later in the discussion. Thank you, Chairman Smith. Let's go over to John Guzet, our senior fellow in legal studies here at the John Locke Foundation. John, I know that you as well have concerns about H.R. 1. What stands out to you?
Well, everything that's been said, I agree with everything that's been said. I think the election changes, which, as Representative Rouser said, will just nationalize the worst of everything we saw in the states during the last election, will make confidence in the integrity of our elections even worse. I mean, we're already at a point in this country where something like 40% of the voters have doubts about the integrity of the last election. And now we're going to see that even more so and forever. And I agree completely with Bradley Smith about the First Amendment issues here. I mean, These are fundamental. The right to assemble, the right to free speech, the right to petition the government. These are fundamental to our system of government and our free society. And this is going to undermine them in a big way because it's going to make people afraid to exercise their expressive rights in the most efficient and effective way, which is by supporting organizations that will suddenly now have to disclose their membership lists. But one more thing I want to point out is it's 800 pages long, and it's full of all kinds of provisions, among which are in numerous places they create private causes of action. That is, they let citizens sue institutions. This thing, one way to look at it, I think maybe we should call it the Full Employment for Election Lawyers Act, because this is going to spawn tremendous amount of litigation in the years to come. It's just going to be a terrible mess.
All right, so folks, we've covered kind of just a summary of the concerns of our panelists, but you're probably thinking, okay, but what about here in North Carolina? Well, we want to get to that as well. Andy Jackson here at the John Locke Foundation has been looking at what the potential impact could be on every single resident here in our state. Andy, welcome to the program. Andy, tell us what your concerns are when you look at how this state would be affected.
Okay, I'm going to go over several things where it's going to affect election law and election administration in North Carolina, in addition to ballots being counted outside the precinct that Congressman Rouser had brought up. In North Carolina, if you vote outside your precinct, you can still vote generally, but it's a provisional ballot where they can actually verify that you are the person that you claim you are. This bill would get rid of that. So I'm going to, real quick, the other disclaimer is the bill actually is now clocking in at 886 pages. So we might, if we end up with any amendments in the Senate, we can end up with a 900 pager, which would make it that much more exciting. And if anybody's playing at home, I've pulled all the documentation that I have from the bill itself, the PDF copy, which is available at Congress's website. I have a link there. We can share it later on for anybody who's interested. So let me go ahead and go through several things that would be different. And this is going to make kind of a nightmare for election administrators at the county and perhaps the state level as well. The first thing I want to talk about, and hopefully I'll be able to see that there, is that it's going to require an independent commission. This styled after the California Commission, not the Iowa Commission. There are several different versions of this, but this is going to be the one in California, where supposedly people that are uninterested in the political process, haven't picked a side on anything, but are still knowledgeable enough to be able to effectively draw districts. I don't know what kind of Venn diagram you're going to find for that population, but it certainly is a small one. And it's going to require every state, including North Carolina, to set up these commissions. And these commissions would be tasked with drawing congressional districts, not state legislative ones, but congressional districts. And if they, for whatever reason, these panels cannot come up with a plan, it goes to a 3-judge panel. And those 3 judges would end up drawing the districts. One thing we might want to remember at the California Commission, we found out in this report from ProPublica that commission was actually manipulated because these folks were insufficiently politically knowledgeable. When they went to these public meetings, the Democratic Party planted folks pretending to be local interested parties to manipulate, to help draw the districts in favor of the Democratic Party. And we will see similar things in every state, including North Carolina, if this passes. Next one is already mentioned. We have a mandate for automatic voter registration. North Carolina already has a kind of motor voter thing where you can opt in when you get your driver's license or you register with a welfare organization. They can ask you, well, would you like to register to vote? And then you can choose. Here, the choice is going to be taken out. You're automatically going to be put in if you have business with the government in some way. So the more business you have with the government, the more likely you're to get automatically registered. And in theory, the computer system will weed out people that are not allowed to vote, particularly non-citizens, because as you know, non-citizens are allowed to drive in the United States, are allowed to get driver's license. But we just heard that Illinois registered over 500 non-citizens through their automatic voter registration. There's also been signs in California that their automatic voter registration had 100,000 mistakes in the process when they kicked that in 2019, some of which included registering non-citizens to vote. So this is going to be another administrative headache that's going to be put on our elections officials. Next thing we have, as previously mentioned, was felon voter registration. In North Carolina, when you have completed your full sentence, and this includes either probation or parole, your voting rights are restored. As a result of a lawsuit, if you are a convicted felon on parole and the only condition remaining of parole is paying some restitution, you also have your right to vote restored. This would get rid of all of that. Everybody would have their right to vote restored, even if they haven't completed their sentence, as long as they're out of the physical detention facility. And by the way, this is likely a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The folks that wrote this bill knew that. So they have a backup provision there for when it inevitably does get struck down, is that it's not going to be an order by law. It's going to be from Congress's power of the purse. Any state that doesn't restore felon voting when they get out of physical detention, we're going to lose federal funding. And so that's the way that they're going to be able to constitutionally implement that. Next thing that we have up is once again, as already mentioned, this will functionally invalidate voter ID. And technically, states will still be allowed to have voter ID. North Carolina, we still have our voter ID tied in the courts, likely, hopefully, to be restored by the end of this year. But it'll mandate that any state that has a voter ID law is required to accept a signed card. Somebody can just sign a card, say, yes, I am actually, Jane Smith, and then they have to accept the ballot. The other issue is, okay, fine enough. You can mark this as provisional, and then at a later date, like other provisional ballots before the county canvass, we can inquire and make sure that this person is actually the person that they say they are. This bill, no, you can't do that. You have to treat those from people that put in a signed card the same as somebody that puts in an ID. So you cannot make those provisional ballots. We can't do anything to verify that the person is who he or she claims to be under this law. The other one is, and once again, I appreciate Congressman Rouser for mentioning these. This would mandate legalized ballot harvesting. Right now in North Carolina, the law is that only a near relative or the voter, him or herself, can submit a ballot. Put it in the mail, drop it off. Under this change, anybody can submit a ballot, no matter what the relation or no relation to the voter. In addition, this prevents states from limiting how many ballots somebody can harvest. So somebody can come in with a shoebox of ballots, somebody can come in with a bushel of ballots, no questions asked, they get dropped off. And I will point out, if this does pass, somebody probably owes Mark Harris an apology, because if this were the law a couple of years ago, he would have been elected because there was never a question about how many ballots were tampered by McCrae Dowless in 2016, allegedly tampered. The trial hasn't come up yet, but it was in the dozens, certainly not 900. So Mark Harris would have been elected under this law because it was a question of how many ballots McCrae Dowless had harvested, not tampered with. And once again, this would require same-day registration. The big change here in North Carolina, you can already change your voting information. It gets marked provisional and they verify your change, and then your vote is counted. Most folks that vote that way with changed information have their vote counted. But this would also require same-day registration on election day. Now, the issue here is that there's no way to verify the information. When you register before election day, when you do same-day registration versus during early voting, at least in theory, they have time at the County Board of Elections to verify who you are. And then if you're not, if it doesn't check out, then they can pull that ballot. There's no way to pull a ballot on election day because it goes straight into the general hopper of ballots that get counted. So this is a way for somebody to kind of slip in at the last minute, get a ballot in, And then lo and behold, we find out a week or two later, well, this person isn't who he or she claimed to be, especially when you don't have voter ID. So these things in total are going to make it kind of wide open for folks. There are many different approaches for people to attack the integrity of our election system. And it's going to be both a problem for integrity and for election administration. And let me get out.
All right, Andy, thank you very much. Again, a lot of information packed into that presentation about the potential impact of H.R. 1 here in North Carolina. So let's bring back everyone into this conversation. Congressman David Rouser from North Carolina's 7th Congressional District. Bradley Smith, he's with the Institute for Free Speech. He's the former chairman of the FEC, and John Guzet, who's Senior Fellow in Legal Studies here at the John Locke Foundation. Gentlemen, let me ask a general question, and feel free to jump in. You know, I hear proponents of H.R. 1 say that this is about making elections easier and more inclusive. They will say it's about removing barriers because we want more people to have an easier time voting, and that's good for democracy to bring more people into the process. So what is your retort to that line of support for H.R. 1?
Well, Donna, if I can just say, if you look at all these provisions, almost all of them make fraud that much easier. That's the fundamental concern, with the legislation from my standpoint. And to counter the argument of the other side, I remember as a little boy when my mom and dad would go and vote. And at that time, you could only vote on one day, and that was election day. You had absentee balloting, which you were overseas military, you could fill out and send in. But no one seemed to have a problem with same day voting, I'm going to call it. Where you show up at the polls on election day and you go and you cast your vote. And I remember seeing the lines, and they were pretty long lines. But I don't remember many people, if anybody, complaining about it. Now, I personally don't have a problem with early vote if you want to have it 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but require a photo identification, because without photo identification, fraud is so much easier. And then when you have this mass mail-in balloting campaign, I can tell you what my colleagues, my congressional colleagues, members of the House from Georgia tell me what happened on election day. They tell me that you've got, of course, all these residents over like a 10, 15-year period that lived at a particular apartment. Well, guess what? That apartment ends up getting 10 different ballots because there are 10 different people that lived there over that time period. Well, I bet you everything that every single one of those ballots were filled out and submitted back. And of course, when you don't have a photo voter ID and you don't have a mechanism to ensure the integrity of that vote, it basically disenfranchises all those who go and vote and do it in a legal and ethical manner. And so that's the fundamental point here, I think. Why can't we at least have voter ID? Have all the changes that you want to have, but let us at least have voter ID. Who can be opposed to that? That's an 80% issue, but the Democrats oppose it every single step of the way. And it's because, unfortunately, they want to game these elections. And that's what you've seen in California. That's what you've seen in these other states. Philadelphia has been notorious for it forever.
Interesting that, Chairman Smith, go ahead.
I was going to say, although again, I focus more on the speech provisions. I want to address this very briefly because it's very important to point out, and the Congressman alluded to it, but we should make it very specific. It has never been easier to vote in this country than it is today. Never even close. There was no state in the country allowed no-fault absentee ballots prior to 1980. Prior to 2000, there was no state in the country allowed provisional balloting. I mean, it has never, ever been easier, and that can't be more firmly emphasized. And against that, we have the fact that prior to last fall's election, roughly 2/3 of Democrats and a little over 70% of Republicans said if they lost, it would be because of fraud. It's often forgotten that Democrats were just as attuned to the idea that any loss they took would be due to fraud. And a lot of this is this sense that, the rules are just changed constantly. The judges step in willy-nilly, and there's no constraints, no order to the electoral process. And I really do think this is something that needs to be addressed. And finally, I want to add just one other consideration I don't think we pay enough attention to, and I'll differ a little bit from the congressman here, which is I really like election day voting. I think as a people, it's a way that we remind ourselves that we are engaged in a self-governing act, and what we do influences our neighbors and forces them to do things if we vote in certain ways. And that there's much to be said for the idea of people voting on election day. Everybody's got the same information. You don't stretch out the campaign. And so I really think that we should be making voting hard. But the idea that voting in this country is a problem today is simply outrageous nonsense.
Can I add something about this? I agree with Mr. Smith. I think for the most part, there may be some need for some exceptions if you're overseas in the military or whatever, but people should vote paper ballots at the polling station on election day. And one of the reasons why is privacy, anonymity, the secret ballot. If one of the problems that I don't hear people bring up very much with absentee ballot, there's no way to know. You don't know who's standing over that person when they fill out their ballot. They may not get to vote the way they want because they can't keep that ballot secret. So I agree. I think we should get back to what Representative Rouser calls same day voting. We should vote on election day at the polling station for the most, except for a few possible exceptions.
Congressman, can you give us a quick update on where this stands now? We know that it did pass in the House. You voted no. It was 220 to 210. So what happens now?
Well, it's in the Senate, of course, and thank goodness for the rules of the United States Senate. And a lot of people have not been as familiar with the rules of the Senate as those who have followed the legislative process very, very closely in Washington for a long time. But the Senate really is designed to protect the voice of the minority. And so you have a little thing called the filibuster. And that requires, if you're going to end debate, it requires 60 votes. We have Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, both Democrat members of the U.S. Senate. Sinema is from Arizona, Joe Manchin from West Virginia. And they both say should the Democrat leadership and the others in the Democrat caucus, should they push to eliminate the filibuster, they're going to vote against it. They won't support it because there has been some concern that they would go nuclear, as they say, and eliminate that 60 vote threshold where any bill that lands in the U.S. Senate would only have a majority vote. Well, if this only had a majority vote in the Senate, we would be in big, big trouble because I guarantee you Joe Biden would be signing it into law. So thank goodness for the rules of the Senate. I personally don't think this bill is going to go anywhere in the U.S. Senate. Schumer probably feels like he's got to bring it up, but they won't get the 60 votes. And as long as Joe Manchin and Sinema remain committed to keeping the filibuster, and unless by some chance they were to cave, I don't think they will. But that would be the only avenue of for this to become law and get to the president's desk for him to sign it into law.
Chairman Smith, you have thoughts on this issue of the filibuster and what the potential is here for the U.S. Senate?
Well, this could be one. I mean, will they blow up the filibuster? I don't know. I think that would be another bad thing generally for democracy. I think that, the Democrats blew up the filibuster for judicial nominees back during the second Obama term. And just a few years later, they greatly regretted it when Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett were confirmed to the Supreme Court. I hope that Democrats, again, they seem to have this sort of short-term will to power. And maybe they feel this bill has enough fixes in it that it will guarantee they won't lose further elections. I mean, it's pretty much aimed at doing that. There's not much secret about it. So maybe they think they can get away with it. But I would hope that cooler heads prevail. And I would hope that Senators Manchin and Sinema stay firm.
We have a comment on Facebook from Clark. Clark writes this: why can't we take photos at registration voting and add to the voter rolls so poll workers have a picture to check when handing a ballot? Takes 2 seconds and costs almost nothing. I haven't heard that idea before.
That would be an interesting idea. There may be logistical hurdles to that. I'd imagine it would be one of those, if you've ever done your driver's license and you get that temporary license where you have your picture printed on the paper card, it's really hard to make out any feature of your face in that, so that they may not be effective. I can't be 100% on that, but I mean, it's an interesting idea. That way you tie the face to it, and I'm not 100% sure of the practicality of implementing it. Now, maybe it is. I'm just not familiar with it enough to know that it would be workable. And plus, if we have, most folks already have, a vast majority of people already have an ID that they carry with them. And so they can have that with them when they get in. You can get a free ID from your local board of elections. There's any number of ways you can have a photo ID. So it may not, even at a small amount, when you're talking about 7 million plus voter registrations and you're going to have the poll books with those pictures attached, it might be a little difficult to implement. Not 100% on that one, though.
You know what I think is fascinating is that if you've lived even a short life, if you are a younger person, you know that to navigate through daily life, there's all sorts of identification required to do all sorts of different things. And some of the things are, inconsequential really, but you have to, if you want to go pick up tickets at a box office, if we one day, hopefully soon, we'll go back to people being in person at theaters and concerts and things, but you have to show an ID of some sort in order to go to will call and get your tickets. Everything from that to cashing a check. I'm a person who actually does write paper checks still on some things. And so it just seems counterintuitive that on something that is so critical, and that would be who it is we are electing to represent us, whether it is in a local race or the presidential race, that some sort of solid identification would be required. It just seems odd to me that there are people who are just adamantly opposed to that. Is it an issue of the history of voter suppression, particularly in an area like the South, which was very real at one time? Is it that legacy, or is it just raw politics?
Donna, I think it's raw politics. When I was in the state Senate, we passed voter ID. And then, of course, I ran for Congress. And in the years after, the legislature passed several different forms of voter ID, as I recall. All of them ended up getting struck down by the courts, if I remember correctly. But the point I want to make is, in every single version that I saw that the legislature passed, we made accommodation for those that didn't have a voter ID, that didn't have a photo ID, where basically the taxpayers would pay for their photo ID. So we structured the laws, we structured the bills to make it as easy as possible for anyone who wanted to vote to also be able to get a photo ID if they did not have one, which again is a very, very, very small portion of the population. So my viewpoint is, all the battles I've been through and everything I've seen, it's just raw politics.
Yeah. I've worked mostly in the NGO world, so I think in that world,
and tell us, NGO meaning what, Andy?
I'm sorry, non-governmental organization. And so our brothers and sisters on the left tend to honestly believe that this is some kind of direct linkage from the Jim Crow era voter suppression tactics to stuff that we see as common sense today. It doesn't mean that they're right. I believe that they're wrong on these things, but I think their motivation generally is genuine on that. It's just that, it doesn't fit the facts on the ground, because as already mentioned, folks who don't have an ID can get one at no cost to themselves. There's systems in the voter ID laws that set it up so that the county boards will help people get those IDs. I mean, and if groups really spent half as much time as they do fighting voter ID, actually saying, well, we're going to set up a little fund to go out and help people, I think the very small minority of folks who don't have an ID and may have some difficulty getting an ID, like maybe they don't have a birth certificate or something, I think those folks, that could be fixed really promptly. So I think that this effort to try to overturn what the voters in North Carolina passed in our constitutional amendment on voter ID is really ultimately a wasted effort.
Let me add here briefly on this. It's kind of interesting because the reason most of these laws have been upheld by the courts is that the plaintiffs haven't really been able to show that voter ID is keeping people from voting. As the district court said in Crawford, what became Crawford v. Marion County, the Supreme Court case that upheld the general validity of these laws, is that, this is a quote from the district court decision, quote, plaintiffs have not introduced evidence of a single individual Indiana resident who will be unable to vote as a result of the voter ID law, or who will have his or her vote unduly burdened by its requirements. So there really isn't much there, and I will say I think what's going on to an extent, I don't think voter ID laws prevent much fraud really, but I think they give people a certain sense of order that may be valuable. But what really happens is the Democratic Party likes to do sort of voter enrollment sweeps in which they kind of go through relatively poor neighborhoods, through campuses and so on. And if you find people in those communities and they don't have the ID at that time, you can't run them down and get them registered to vote, right? And so that's sort of the problem. It's not that this really prevents people from voting. It prevents organizers from hustling people to the polls at the last minute. And that's the real concern, that they have people who otherwise wouldn't vote and wouldn't really care about voting, but are being kind of shepherded in. They go into campus colleges and they're like, hey, here are the pretty girls. They're going down to vote. Don't you guys want to go vote? And they do. And that's literally kind of the way it occurs at times. So I think that's what's really going on here.
You used an interesting phrase, Chairman Smith, that voter ID might give us a sense of order that might be helpful. I get very concerned, and I'd love to know what y'all are thinking about this. I get very concerned about the sense of unrest and distrust of not just public institutions, but of individuals with whom we disagree. And we seem to be living through a time, at least in my time on Earth, that I haven't really seen before. Perhaps other people have experienced different instances that I just haven't, but I get concerned about this loss of trust of pretty much anyone and anything. So does HR 1 play into this?
I think it definitely does, Donna, and I'm very concerned about the lack of trust that we have in our political institutions today. And of course, when 40% of the American population is suspect of the presidential election from this past fall, it just feeds into that, so much more. This is a real problem moving forward, and the integrity of our elections, if the vast majority of Americans who go and vote legitimately do not feel like an election is in fact legitimate, it's a real problem. It makes it that much harder to govern when in fact the American populace does not necessarily believe that those that should rightfully be in office are in office, and it just really adds to the partisan divide. I think there's a number of reasons for the divisions we have in the country. I think social media is a big part of it. A lot of people turn to various news outlets that they believe wholeheartedly, when in fact maybe what's being reported is 50% true, or 25% true, or maybe even 5% true in the worst cases. So I don't know how we bridge that gap, but we got to find a way to do so. But let me underscore it with this. I think the reason why you have so many divisions in the country today and the reason why people are turning to their favorite news sources, regardless of whether everything they're getting is factual, is because that they have lost faith in the government institutions. They don't necessarily believe me when I say something on radio or on TV. Those who are conservative don't necessarily believe a Democrat when they hear them talk on radio or TV or Facebook, whatever platform it is. There used to be a day and time where you might not agree with someone, but you viewed them as honest and duly elected and doing the best they could for the people. And that's really started to break down. And if you don't have integrity in elections, it just breaks down that much more.
We've got an go ahead.
I was just going to add to that, going back to the court cases about voter ID in North Carolina, that was actually part of the problem there, is that the judges in the injunctions, the federal one, which has been since overturned, we still have a state injunction in place, was essentially based on animus from the judge towards the General Assembly. They essentially flipped the presumption on that so that the state legislature had to prove that voter ID was not disenfranchising. And of course, that's a difficult standard to do. Usually the plaintiffs at least have a 50% plus one burden. And they didn't do that. And so that level of not even believe in a co-equal branch of government it's seeped in even to our judicial system.
We've got a comment on Facebook from our friend Andy Taylor. It's a comment and a question. Andy writes, "It's clear ballot harvesting has much more potential for fraud than voter ID for in-person voting. Do you think Republicans made a strategic mistake going all in on voter ID over the past decade?"
I don't think so, because voter ID is an 80% issue. Now, I've not seen a poll on it lately, but I remember serving in the state Senate, and we were looking at the poll numbers, on a variety of subjects, and voter ID was at 80%. I mean, it ranked high among Democrats, it ranked high among Republicans. And of course, it's because of the courts that it's not in full effect, today in North Carolina. So I think it's a winner of an issue because it makes so much common sense. I've never seen anything that polled at 80% that didn't, that had any adverse effect, quite honestly. And I would be surprised if it's not 80% or greater today.
I think the point Andy was trying to make, though, is that it's not just whether or not this is a popular issue with the voters, it's how much of an impact does it have on the actual outcome of the election. And in that regard, I think he's right. Ballot harvesting is a much, much bigger problem than people voting under a false name.
John?
I would agree with that totally. We've got to do everything that we can to prevent ballot harvesting in all these states where they have it. And I know in Georgia and elsewhere, they're trying to clean that up.
Right. In North Carolina, it was already illegal, and we realized that the approach wasn't sufficient. So the state legislature in 2019 had to pass reforms to not just make it illegal, which it already was, but to also make it less practical, to make it more difficult for folks to get multiple ballots, because the more difficult you make something, the more expensive it becomes, and it takes some of the profit motive out. Because folks that do ballot harvest in the end, they're in to get paid. As a matter of fact, HR 1 allows people who harvest ballots to get paid. They just can't have it matched per number of votes. Like, can't have 50 cents per ballot. But folks know who's going to be effective. And the people that are effective in harvesting lots of ballots in 1 year, they're going to get rehired, and this will become regular income. And this is an area that can be exploited. I don't think it's an accident that the counties that we've had these ballot harvesting problems that we know about in the past are some of your poorer areas, your Yancey counties, your Swain counties, Robeson, Bladen, because this is a nice little secondary source of income for folks. As the ballot harvesting hearing we found out then. And so I think that allowing folks to get paid through this activity is another way that HR 1 is a really big mistake.
John, I want to address or ask you to address an issue that I believe Chairman Smith actually referred to when we began our conversation. There's just so many different components in HR 1. As has been pointed out, it's more than 800 pages and all sorts of things are in it. John, one of the things that is in this has to do with nonprofit organizations and revealing who made donations to different nonprofit groups. And I know that you have written on a number of different occasions about your opposition to what's commonly known as donor disclosure rules. And there's an ugly history there of using donor disclosure in this country actually to suppress civil rights.
Well, that's right, Donna. A lot of people seem to have forgotten, but I haven't. Back in the 1950s, when the NAACP was starting to win some victories in its fight against segregation and Jim Crow laws, they were suppressed through donor disclosure laws all across the South. State attorneys general and state legislatures put in place rules that said, if you want to operate in our state, you have to give us the names of your donors. They knew that if that donor disclosure would drive away supporters because they would be afraid of retaliation from people who didn't like what they were doing. And I would think the Democrats would be ashamed to be reviving this strategy today, but evidently they think we've all forgotten and they can get away with it.
Well, Donna, if I can add real quick, so there are many out there combing the FEC reports today. My donors are receiving all kinds of letters. Some of them are a gentle ask, a polite ask, please don't donate again to David Rouser. Others are outright nasty and very bullying. This is happening. I've got donors of mine that have received 80 to 100 plus letters, most of which are pretty nasty because of their support, their financial support for me. So this is how the left likes to operate. They just operate on under very different pretenses, very different principles than those of us who are conservative and on the right.
Yeah, two thoughts on that. I mean, one is it's kind of interesting. Is I can't remember if it's Congressman Rouser or Andy pointed out that the Democrats sometimes say, well, voter ID has a history from Jim Crow or something. I mean, the real obvious blatant history from Jim Crow is the donor disclosure, the detailed donor disclosure, as John mentioned, the NAACP case, and there were several others also based on similar efforts to force disclosure, including not just groups like the NAACP, but labor unions and so on in the past. And it's very, we live in a society that's very different. When these laws were first put in place, even when I started doing, election work, I mean, if you wanted to know who disclosed to a campaign, you had to go down to the offices of the Federal Election Commission and look through microfiche. Old timers will remember, it had this little screen. You turn this handle like a film strip moved across your screen in a big clunky terminal. And you had to do all this manually. And now a person can sit down in the middle of a job interview. I could be doing it right now, as we're talking here, looking up who people gave money to, somebody who's up for a partnership in a law firm or all kinds of things. And of course, we've seen that we're also in a culture which is much more hostile to dissenting opinions. I hear people say this all the time. They need to be held accountable for their opinions. I don't even know what that means, to be held accountable for voicing an opinion on an election, But what it seems to mean to these people is we're going to not just try to combat their ideas, but we're going to try to ruin their lives, get them fired from their jobs, harass them, force them to move out of town. And these stories exist, and they are there. And some people have heard of high-profile ones like Brendan Eich, the founder of Mozilla, who was forced out of his job for a contribution he made like a decade before. But it also goes to much more defenseless people. In many states, the disclosure limits are as little as $10 or $20. And we have cases of people who gave, say, $100 to a campaign who are hounded from their jobs. In one case, a person was a manager at a restaurant, and it was owned by her family. And she finally left and moved out of state because it was going to bankrupt her family's restaurant, because these people were boycotting the restaurant because they wouldn't fire her because she gave $100 to a cause that they didn't like. So this is not a trivial thing. It's not something that just affects, fat cat donors. It's going to affect all Americans in the future.
Which makes me wonder, how in the world does this make this into this bill, HR 1? Because is there somehow
because they want that.
But is there a presumption, though, that only a certain type of voter is going to access the information and then just be a bully to another person? I mean, it seems to me that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, as they say.
I think that's true, but, I don't think we do see that, right? I mean, conservatives generally don't act that way. It was, liberal groups that sent swarms of reporters out through the Indiana countryside looking for some pizza shop or diner that might not service a gay wedding, so they could boycott it and harass the owners. And this is amplified by a culture on social media and traditional media, which is very liberal, very left wing. So they'll amplify people who give to the wrong causes, quote, wrong causes on the right, but not to the wrong causes on the left. This is very scary stuff, and I think people should be much more worried about it than in fact they are.
John, I know that your concern on this is not just for the the potential for the outright doxing of people and harassment and trying to get people fired, but for just the average Jane or Joe who wants to give a few dollars to a nonprofit group that with with whom they share values or views. It'll simply intimidate them into being silenced.
Yes, that's right. I mean, for every person that is publicly doxxed or loses their job, there'll probably be 100 who will simply stop supporting the organizations because they're afraid. And that's the worst part of it, because it just makes people afraid to exercise their First Amendment rights to free expression. I just don't see how we can countenance that, and if we want to preserve our liberal republic and our free country.
But yet I think that the supporters of this type of provision have been very successful at how they have messaged on this. I mean, who among us doesn't understand the phrase dark money? I mean, we hear that a lot, that this is about the idea that they promote is to get rid of the bad actors, so to speak, as if there are bad people who are trying to influence elections and they're pushing the good people out. That's been very effective.
Well, I think it has been affected. That dark money and the idea that we need sunlight and so on, that all sounds good, but what it really means is we're getting rid of privacy. Privacy is something that people used to value, and I think a lot of people still do it. We could do a better job with the messaging, and we need to.
There's two things going on here. One is, dark money, as it's classically described, that is money that is given to an organization, which then spends it on political speech and doesn't have to disclose all of its donors because it's not a political action committee. It can't be its primary purpose to do campaign related speech, right? Those organizations, that amount of money has ranged between 2% and 4% in American politics. It's a very small amount. It really is kind of a non-issue, right? But by focusing on it, they've been very effective in creating this idea. And they say, well, millions are spent. Well, yeah, millions are spent because, like in the last election, we spent like $8 or $10 billion on politics. 1% of $8 billion is millions, right? But the other problem that then comes up here with this is that losing my train of thought here. We have this. It's the effort to expand this definition of dark money. So it's no longer just when you gave money directly to, say, Congressman Rouser's campaign or someone else's campaign, people say, well, I want to know if he's beholden to donors or something like that, right? But now we're doing it, and we're giving, we're requiring mandatory disclosure of people who are giving to groups like, the Sierra Club or the Rifle Association or Planned Parenthood or Right to Life or whatever. Sometimes they're giving for political reasons, sometimes for other reasons because they care about the cause. They're not going specifically to a politician's campaign. And I think that's a very dangerous expansion of these laws in an effort to really kind of drive people out and drive voices out of the public debate.
Congressman Rouser, you've got to be, I would think, quite concerned about where this could be heading for someone who wants to step into the public arena and put themselves out as a potential elected leader. Do you think that H.R. 1 has the potential to just not only end up in people saying, hey, I'm not even going to make a donation to a group, but I'm certainly not going to even think about running for office?
Well, absolutely, and you're seeing that today. I run into folks all the time that say, and they've known me for a long time, and they'll say, I don't know how you deal in the climate that we have today, because it is brutal, it's nasty, and again, like I mentioned, I've got my own daughters who are being harassed by left-wing, individuals in groups with all the mail that they're receiving, simply because of their financial support for me. This is the type of thing that you would expect in socialist and communist countries to its fullest extent. This is the early version of it, and what we have in this country is very precious, but it's also very fragile. And our system of government requires an informed and moral citizenry. It doesn't work very well otherwise. And again, that goes back to the integrity of elections as well. That's a fundamental piece. So am I concerned about it? You bet I'm concerned about it. And we're going to have to step up and start fighting back. And you hate to use the tactics of the left. Those of us on the right, we believe in honor. We believe in doing things the right way. We believe in being nice to our fellow man. And I'm not saying we need to deviate from that, but we've got to do a better job of fighting back. That's for sure.
If this were to make its way over to the Senate and successfully be passed, I know that hasn't the question attached to it about the filibuster, but let's just say for the sake of discussion that this becomes law. Is it even constitutional? I mean, it just seems like there's all sorts of things in here that would be ripe for legal challenge.
Well, there are.
I think that's definitely true. But the problem would be the damage in the interim.
John?
Oh, I was just going to point out two things in particular. One is, of course, as I've already been harping on, these donor disclosure rules, I think, violate the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. But in addition, I don't see how, I mean, arguably, Congress has some power to regulate elections for congressmen and senators, but I don't think they've got any power at all under the Constitution to regulate elections for president in the way these do. And they certainly don't have any power to regulate state elections. So I think I'm sure it will be challenged immediately. I think ultimately some of those challenges will succeed.
Yeah, some of them, and what they have though is there are severability clauses all through this thing. So it's kind of like, well, let's put everything we ever hope to get into one big bill, push it on through, and then if things get cut off through court challenges, well, at least, you know, if we've lost 5 or 6 things, but we've still got a dozen things that we can push through. So I think that I think the folks that wrote this are probably aware that a lot of these provisions would get struck down, but they're not sure. They're just throwing things on the wall and hoping some of them will stick, I think.
Chairman Smith, is that the strategy at play here? Put everything in and then end up getting some of it?
Yeah, I'd agree with all three of my co-panelists on what they've just said about the constitutionality. There are a number of provisions that I think are at least of questionable constitutionality, several that I think are clear on constitutionality. But I think to a large extent, it's just we're going to put everything in there. And it's kind of funny, again, you go back to this, you know, leftist obsession with anything that might have roots that go back to like the civil rights or pre-slavery or anything. But this is exactly what they're doing here is we're just going to create so many laws that it's kind of like whack-a-mole. And that was a strategy of the segregationists back in the 1950s and in the whole Jim Crow era was, you know, the courts would strike down laws and they would just pass something else. And the courts couldn't keep up. You know, the litigation takes a long time. As the congressman says, you can have a lot of damage in the interim. So yes, I do think that's part of the strategy here.
Well, maybe we should just say it's a democratic strategy consistently down through the ages, huh?
Unfortunately, we're coming to a close here on our time, but Congressman Rouser, I'd like to give you the last word. So we know you voted no. This is been approved by the House of Representatives. It now sits in the United States Senate. So what can someone who is concerned about it, someone who's watching us, listening to you today, what can people do?
Well, take a look at your Rolodex and see who you know in these states where they have Democrat senators, and call and write and email and call and write and email and just do it every single day. That's what the left does so well. I say in these other states that have Democrat members of the Senate, because in North Carolina we have Richard Byrd and we have Tom Tillis, and I know they're opposed to this awful piece of legislation. So you can call and thank them, but then look through your Rolodex and see who you know in other states, and call and get your friends in those other states or colleagues in those other states, get them engaged. You know, ultimately the American people will get what they want. We just got to make sure that the American people are informed and understand the long-term consequences of this. And that's a daily battle, quite honestly.
Congressman David Rouser represents North Carolina's 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Bradley Smith is the chairman with the Institute for Free Speech. He is the former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. And Dr. Andy Jackson, director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity here at the John Locke Foundation. And John Guzet, who is an attorney and senior fellow in legal studies, also here at the Locke Foundation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your perspective on all of this. And as always, we thank you for joining in and being concerned and wanting to become more informed about what's happening here in North Carolina and across our country. As you have witnessed here today, H.R. 1 could have a very, very serious impact, not only to our country as a whole, but right here in North Carolina. And the issue of election integrity is a big one. That's why we focus on it here at the John Locke Foundation. We want to make sure that people are informed so that anyone who is legally entitled to vote has an opportunity to do that. That's what we want to see happen with free and fair elections here in our state. Now, if you like what you're seeing here at Shaftesbury Society, I would ask you to consider making a tax-deductible donation to the John Locke Foundation to help further our work, to bring you these forums, to do the work on election integrity that Andy Jackson and John Guzet are doing. We would be most appreciative if you would consider that. It's very fast and easy. Go to johnlocke.org. The upper right-hand corner, there is a donate tab. Just click on that. It's safe, secure, takes you less than 2 minutes to do that. And if you decide to do that, thank you very much. But no matter what you decide, we hope you're going to join us again next Monday for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. Love having you along. On behalf of the entire team here at the Locke Foundation, I'm Donna Martinez. Hope you'll join us again next week. Have a great week, everybody.